The dust of FOB Kestrel's perch was a living thing. It was a fine, pale silt that coated everything. The stacked HESCO barriers, the drooping camouflage netting, the very air breathed by the soldiers who called this remote mountain outpost home. It got into weapon mechanisms, into coffee, into the creases of maps. When Sergeant Anya Sharma stepped off the C-47, her boots sinking into the gravelly landing pad, the dust greeted her like an old, unwelcome relative. She carried a single duffel and a hardened Pelican case, her movements economical, her face a mask of detached neutrality. She was assigned to the S4, logistics. Her job was to make sense of the chaotic inbound and outbound flow of supplies, a task made nearly impossible by the FOB's tenuous connection to the outside world. To the infantrymen of Bravo Company who owned this jagged piece of rock, she was just another REMF, a rear echelon mother, sent to count beans and bullets while they did the real work. The first notice they took of her was in the mess tent. It was a long, canvas structure that smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade chili mac. Sharma sat alone at the end of a long table, methodically eating her food, her gaze fixed on the tablet propped against a salt shaker. She was reviewing digital manifests, her focus absolute. She'd rolled up the sleeves of her uniform in the oppressive heat, and that's when they saw it. On the inside of her right forearm was a tattoo. It was a stark, black raven, its wings half spread as if caught between flight and landing. The artistry was severe, all sharp angles and deep, solid ink, devoid of color or shading. It was a brutalist bird, ancient and predatory. Corporal Griggs, a thick-necked infantryman with a reputation for a loud mouth and a short temper, noticed it first. He nudged Specialist Rivas, sitting next to him. "Get a load of the new supply sergeant. Looks like she got lost on her way to a poetry slam." Rivas snickered, his mouth full of cornbread. "That's some serious ink for a POG. Bet she thinks it makes her look tough." The comments were just loud enough to carry. Sharma didn't flinch. Her eyes didn't lift from the screen. Her fork continued its steady journey from plate to mouth. This lack of reaction was, to men like Griggs, an invitation. He swaggered over, his tray in hand, and sat down opposite her, a smirk plastered on his face. His two fire team members, Rivas and a quiet kid named Chun, followed him like pilot fish. "Nice tattoo, Sergeant," Griggs began, his voice dripping with condescension. "What's it supposed to be? A crow? A blackbird? You a fan of old horror movies?" Sharma finished a line of text on her tablet, swiped to the next page, and then finally lifted her eyes. They were a dark, steady brown, and they held his gaze without a flicker of emotion. "It's a raven," she said, her voice quiet and even. "A raven," Griggs repeated, drawing the word out. "Right? Very artistic. You get that done back in the rear, where the biggest danger is a paper cut." Sharma took a sip of water. She didn't answer. Her silence was a wall, and Griggs felt an immediate need to break it down. He saw her as an outsider, a support soldier trying to appropriate the warrior aesthetic he and his men earned with sweat and blood. That tattoo on her arm felt like an insult. "You know, Sergeant," he leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was still loud enough for the whole table to hear. "Out here, tattoos mean something. They tell a story about where you've been, what you've done. This," he gestured vaguely at her arm. "This looks like something you picked off a wall in a strip mall parlor." The other soldiers at the table chuckled. Sharma carefully placed her fork down. She looked at Griggs, then at Rivas and Chen, her expression unreadable. She hadn't been at the FOB for more than 6 hours, and she was already the subject of a public dissection. It was a familiar ritual. She had seen it at every duty station. The initial sizing up, the casual dismissal, the territorial posturing of men who defined their worth by the proximity of their job to the sound of gunfire. She stood up, her tray in her hands. "Enjoy your meal, Corporal," she said, her voice still perfectly level. She turned and walked away, her back straight, her stride measured. She scraped her tray, deposited it in the wash bin, and walked out of the mess tent into the swirling dust without a backward glance. Griggs watched her go, a triumphant sneer on his face. See? Can't even handle a little friendly conversation. Desk jockeys. All of them, he felt he had won, had put the new sergeant in her place. He had established the hierarchy. He was the wolf and she was the sheep, no matter what kind of bird she had inked on her skin. Over the next week, the pattern of dismissal solidified. Sharma was a ghost in the command post. She was ruthlessly efficient. Supply requests that had been lost in the system for months were suddenly fulfilled. Broken comms gear was inventoried and flagged for priority replacement. She spoke only when necessary. Her reports to the company commander, Captain Eva Rostova, were concise and brutally honest. She pointed out flaws in the FOB's power grid redundancy and vulnerabilities in their long-range comms array. Rostova, a pragmatic officer, listened and made notes, but the enlisted grunts saw only a woman who spent her days staring at screens and her nights alone. Griggs and his squad made her a running joke. They called her Sergeant Raven or the Quartermaster of Goth. They would leave raven feathers they found on the ground outside her small containerized housing unit. They saw her practicing hand-to-hand drills alone behind the motor pool at dawn. Her movements fluid and precise, and dismissed it as a Tabo workout video. They saw her field stripping and cleaning an M4 she had signed out from the armory, her actions impossibly fast and sure, and assumed she was just trying to look the part. Every sign of competence was reinterpreted through their lens of contempt as performance. Her quiet professionalism was arrogance. Her solitude was weakness. The tattoo remained the focal point of their ridicule, a symbol of what they perceived as her unearned claim to a warrior identity. Colonel Madsen, the battalion commander, flew in on the third week for a routine inspection. He was a tall, lean man with graying temples and eyes that had seen too much. He moved with the quiet authority of a man who had spent 30 years at war. He missed nothing. During his tour of the command post, he observed Sharma for a full 5 minutes. She was cross-referencing ammunition expenditure reports with incoming flight manifests, her fingers flying across the keyboard. She didn't seem to notice him standing there. He glanced at her personnel file on his tablet. Sergeant Anya Sharma, logistics specialist, impeccable record, multiple deployments to places that were officially quiet but known to be anything but. A string of commendations for meritorious service. It was a solid, if unremarkable, file for a support NCO. Nothing in it hinted at anything more. Later, in the mess tent, Madsen sat with Captain Rostova, discussing the FOB's operational readiness. Griggs and his squad were a few tables away, loudly recounting a recent patrol. Griggs caught sight of Sharma entering the tent and nudged Rivas again. "Look, the Raven has landed," he said, his voice carrying in the relative quiet. "Probably here to make sure we're not using too many napkins. It's a critical strategic resource, you know." Colonel Madsen's head came up. He followed Griggs's gaze to Sharma, who was getting a cup of coffee, seemingly oblivious. He saw the tattoo on her arm as she reached for the pot. His eyes narrowed slightly. He watched her for a moment longer, a strange, thoughtful expression on his face, before turning back to Captain Rostova. But the captain noticed the shift. The colonel had seen something that had snagged his attention in a way a corporal's lazy joke never could. The crisis arrived, as it always did, without warning. The sky, which had been a brilliant, cloudless blue for weeks, turned a bruised purple in the space of an hour. The wind, once a dry, dusty whisper, began to howl, a high, keening shriek that tore at the tents and rattled the windows of the plywood buildings. The temperature plummeted. Snow began to fall. Not the gentle flakes of a winter postcard, but a blinding, horizontal blizzard that descended from the mountain peaks like an avalanche of air. Within 2 hours, FOB Kestrel's perch was entombed in white. Visibility dropped to 0. The diesel generators sputtered in the thin, freezing air. But the real problem was communications. The high-frequency satellite dishes, caked in inches of ice, lost their lock. The backup line-of-sight repeaters on the surrounding ridges went dead, their solar panels buried, their batteries frozen. The FOB was deaf and blind. And Alpha 3 was still out there, A 12-man reconnaissance patrol, led by a promising young lieutenant named Foley, had been tracking insurgent movement in a valley 15 kilometers to the north. Their last check-in had been 3 hours ago, a routine all clear, just as the storm began to gather. Now, there was only static. Captain Rostova stood in the Tactical Operations Center, TOC, her face grim. The comm specialists, 2 young soldiers barely out of their advanced training, were frantically trying to reestablish a link, their efforts futile. "Anything?" Rostova snapped. "Negative, ma'am," one of them replied, his voice tight with stress. "The ice accumulation on the main array is too thick, and the atmospheric conditions are playing hell with every frequency we try. It's like trying to shout through a mountain." Griggs and the rest of Bravo Company's first platoon were crowded into the TOC, their patrol gear still on. They were the quick reaction force, ready to move, but they had nowhere to go. They couldn't search for a patrol they couldn't talk to in a storm they couldn't see through. The mood was grim, a knot of anxiety tightening in every chest. Lieutenant Foley and his men were good soldiers, but no one could survive long out in this. It was then that Sharma walked in. She moved through the tense crowd with her usual quiet purpose, holding a steaming mug of coffee. She wasn't looking at the frantic comm specialists, but at a piece of equipment gathering dust in the corner. An old and Parsi 77, a Prick 77, a relic from a war fought decades ago. It was an analog, low-band VHF radio that most of the younger soldiers wouldn't even know how to operate. She walked over to it, set her mug down, and ran a hand over its cold, metal casing. Colonel Madsen, who had taken command of the situation, watched her, his expression unreadable. "What are you doing, Sergeant?" Captain Rostova asked, her tone sharp with impatience. "The new gear is designed for optimal conditions, Captain," Sharma said without turning around. "It's powerful but fragile. It relies on a clean signal path. This," she patted the old radio, "is a brick. It's not smart. It's not efficient. But it's durable. And low-band VHF can sometimes achieve strange things in bad weather. Tropospheric ducting. It can follow the curvature of the Earth if the conditions are just right." The senior comms sergeant scoffed. "Ducting is a fluke, Sergeant. You can't rely on it. Besides, we don't have a compatible long-range antenna array for that relic." Sharma finally turned. She looked at the comm sergeant, then at the colonel. "We do," she said simply. "The old log periodic antenna behind the motor pool. The one everyone uses to hang their laundry on. It was never decommissioned. If we can run a coaxial cable from here to there and bypass the frozen junction box, we might be able to create a signal." She paused. "And Alpha 3 is carrying a PRC-77 in their emergency kit. It's standard procedure for deep reconnaissance patrols in mountainous terrain. Lieutenant Foley is smart. When his primary radio went down, he would have switched to it." There was a moment of stunned silence. The sheer depth of her technical knowledge, so calmly delivered, was jarring. Colonel Madsen stared at her, a flicker of something, not just interest but recognition in his eyes. "You can make that work?" he asked, his voice cutting through the room's tension. "I can try, sir," Sharma replied. "Then do it," Madsen ordered. "Griggs, get your fire team. Give the sergeant whatever she needs. Rope, gear, manpower. Make it happen. Now." Griggs was momentarily speechless. He was being ordered to take instructions from the desk jockey he'd been mocking for weeks, but the colonel's command was steel. "Yes, sir," he bit out. "You heard him. Rivas, Chun, let's move." The next hour was a blur of frantic, focused activity. The storm raged outside, a physical manifestation of their desperation. Sharma was no longer a quiet logistician. She was a field engineer in her element. She directed Griggs and his men with a calm, precise authority that left no room for argument. "Griggs, I need you to anchor a safety line to that structural beam. Chun, get me the heavy-duty toolkit from the maintenance bay. Rivas, find me 50 meters of RG-213 coaxial cable and a crimping tool. The connectors need to be silver-plated, not nickel. Check the comms maintenance locker. Her instructions were so specific, so confident, that the soldiers simply obeyed, their muscle memory taking over. They worked in the howling wind, the snow stinging their faces like needles. Sharma, seemingly impervious to the cold, worked on the junction box, her gloved fingers surprisingly nimble as she stripped wires and rerouted connections. Griggs, holding a high-powered flashlight on her work, watched in grudging awe. She moved with an economy of motion he'd only ever seen in bomb disposal technicians. There was no wasted effort, no hesitation. Inside, she hooked the old radio up to a power source and began modifying its internals, cannibalizing parts from a broken satellite phone with the soldering iron she'd produced from her Pelican case. The young comms specialists watched, their expressions a mixture of confusion and amazement. She was doing things that weren't in any technical manual they had ever read. "What are you doing?" one of them asked. "Boosting the output stage and narrowing the bandwidth," she said without looking up, the smell of hot solder filling the air. "We're not trying to have a conversation. We're just trying to send a signal they can hear, a beacon." After what felt like an eternity, she was done. The PRC-77 was connected to the long-range antenna. She put on a headset, her face illuminated by the green glow of the radio's frequency display. The TOC was silent, the only sound the roar of the wind outside and the faint crackle of static in the speakers. Sharma keyed the microphone. She didn't send a frantic call. She sent a simple, repeating three-tone sequence, an old-school homing signal. She sent it again and again. The static hissed back at them. Minutes stretched into an eternity. Hope began to curdle into despair. "It's no use," the senior comms sergeant muttered. "Wait," Sharma said, her voice sharp. She held up a hand for silence, her head cocked. She adjusted a dial by a fraction of a millimeter. And then they heard it. Faint, almost lost in the noise, but unmistakable. A clicking sound. Click, 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 click. Morse code. A single letter repeated. V. For Victor. It was the prearranged emergency signal for alive. Awaiting instructions. A wave of relief washed through the TOC. A ragged cheer went up. But Sharma's work wasn't done. She began transmitting, her hand a blur on the Morse key. Her questions were short, precise. Pos, inch, WX, position, injuries, weather. The reply came back, slow and labored. The sender was weak, his hand likely half-frozen. She scribbled on a notepad, translating the faint clicks into letters and numbers. A grid coordinate. For men with severe hypothermia. One with a broken leg. The storm was just as bad where they were. They were holed up in a shallow cave, but their time was running out. She handed the coordinates to Captain Rostova. The location was in a treacherous part of the valley, a maze of ravines and rockfalls. Trying to reach it in this blizzard was a suicide mission. "No vehicle can get through this," Rostova said, staring at the map. "We can't fly. It would take a foot patrol 12 hours to get there in good weather. In this, they won't make it. They're less than 5 kilometers from the old shepherd's hut," Sharma said quietly, pointing to a spot on the paper map. "It's not on the digital charts. It's stone, built into the hillside. It would offer real shelter from the wind." Colonel Madsen looked from the map to her face. "How do you know that?" "I study the terrain where I'm stationed, sir," she replied simply. "Paper maps sometimes have details the satellite imagery misses. Even if they can get there, we can't," Griggs interjected, his voice raw. "We'll get lost in 10 minutes out there. The GPS is useless in this storm, and you can't see your own feet, let alone navigate by terrain." Sharma looked at the colonel. Her expression was calm, but her eyes were intense. "I can get a team there," she said. The certainty in her voice was absolute. It wasn't a boast. It was a statement of fact. Madsen studied her for a long moment. He saw the logistics sergeant, the quiet woman from the command post. But he also saw the person who had jury-rigged a dead radio, who knew Morse code like a native language, who had memorized old paper maps of a foreign land. He was looking at a ghost, a professional hiding in plain sight. "All right, Sergeant," he said, his decision made. Pick your team. You're in charge. Get our people back. Sharma's gaze swept the room and landed on Griggs. I need his team, she said. They're strong and they know how to handle casualties. And they're already geared up. Griggs felt a cold knot form in his stomach. He was being placed under the command of Sergeant Raven, the woman he had relentlessly mocked, on a mission that would almost certainly kill them all. He looked at the colonel, hoping for some kind of reprieve, but Madsen's face was stone. You have your orders, Corporal, Madsen said. Stay attached to the sergeant. Do exactly as she says. Her life and the lives of Alpha 3 are in your hands. And your life is in hers. The trek through the blizzard was a descent into a special kind of hell. The world was reduced to a swirling vortex of white. The wind, a physical force that battered them, stole their breath, and leached the warmth from their bones. Their high-tech gear was worthless. The digital compasses on their wrists spun uselessly, and their night vision goggles showed only a blinding sheet of white noise. They were walking blind. But Sharma was not blind. She moved with a preternatural sense of direction, a human compass. She had them roped together with herself in the lead. She didn't use a map or a compass. She seemed to navigate by instinct, by the feel of the ground beneath her boots, the angle of the slope, the subtle shifts in the wind's direction against her cheek. We need to bear left here, she would shout over the gale. There's a gully about 50 meters ahead. We'll follow it down. Griggs, stumbling behind her, couldn't comprehend how she knew. To him, every direction was the same chaotic white. He had spent his entire career learning to trust his gear, his GPS, his satellite uplinks. Now all of that was gone, and he was forced to trust this woman. The arrogance had been sandblasted out of him by the storm, replaced by a raw, primal fear. And in the center of that fear was a growing, undeniable respect. She was completely at home in this chaos. She was the calm at the eye of the storm. After 2 hours, Chin slipped. The snow-covered rock he stepped on gave way, and he tumbled toward the edge of a steep, unseen drop. The rope snapped taut, yanking hard on Sharma and Griggs. Griggs dug his boots in, straining to hold the line, but he was losing his footing on the ice. Sharma didn't hesitate. In a single, fluid motion, she unclipped an ice axe from her pack, spun, and slammed it deep into a frozen fissure in the rock face, creating a solid anchor. The rope groaned, but it held. Working with terrifying speed, she set up a secondary anchor and helped a shaken Griggs haul Chun back to solid ground. Check your bindings, she ordered, her voice calm and authoritative, betraying no sign of the adrenaline that was surely pumping through her. Everyone drink water. We rest for 2 minutes, then we move. Griggs looked at her, his breath fogging in the frigid air. She had just saved his soldier's life, and likely his own, with a level of skill and instinct he'd never witnessed. The jokes about her being a desk jockey felt like a distant, shameful memory from another lifetime. Who was this woman? For hours after they left the FOB, when Griggs was sure they were hopelessly lost and marching to their deaths, Sharma stopped. We're here, she yelled. He looked around. All he saw was a wall of snow and rock. But Sharma was already digging at the base of the rock face with her entrenching tool. A few feet down, she hit wood. It was the top of a low, sturdy door. They had found the shepherd's hut. Inside, they found Alpha 3. The men were huddled together, pale and shivering, their faces etched with frostbite. The lieutenant, Foley, had managed to splint his radioman's broken leg, but they were all in the advanced stages of hypothermia. They were fading fast. Again, Sharma took command. She was no longer a navigator. She was a combat medic. She triaged the casualties with a practiced eye, issuing orders to Griggs and his men. Rivas, get the MRE heaters going. We need to get warm liquids into them. Chun, cut their wet clothes off them. Griggs, help me with the lieutenant. We need to get him into a hypothermia wrap. They worked by the light of their headlamps, a small pocket of frantic life in the frozen wilderness. As Sharma was treating Lieutenant Foley, cutting away his sleeve to check his pulse, her own sleeve rode up her arm, fully exposing the black raven tattoo. One of the rescued soldiers, a grizzled master sergeant named Corrigan who had been semi-conscious, stirred. His eyes, glazed with pain and cold, focused on her arm. His lips moved, but no sound came out. He tried again, his voice a dry, rasping whisper. "Morrigan," he breathed. The name hung in the tiny, crowded space. It meant nothing to Griggs or his men, but Sharma froze for a fraction of a second. Her eyes met the master sergeant's. A silent, instantaneous communication passed between them. It was a look of pure, undiluted recognition. Corrigan's eyes widened, a flicker of awe cutting through his delirium. "It's you," he whispered, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. They said you were a ghost story." Before anyone could ask what he meant, the door to the hut was thrown open, and a blast of snow and wind roared in. Framed in the opening were two figures, covered in snow. It was Colonel Madsen and the company medic. They had followed Sharma's team's tracks, a risky but necessary gamble. Madsen took in the scene, the injured men, the efficient triage, Sharma kneeling by Foley's side. His eyes fell on her exposed forearm, on the stark black raven. Then he looked at Master Sergeant Corrigan, and he heard the whispered name that still seemed to echo in the small hut. Morrigan. A look of profound understanding dawned on Colonel Madsen's face. His military bearing cracked for a moment, replaced by something that looked like shock, or perhaps reverence. The pieces clicked into place. The impossible navigation, the encyclopedic knowledge of old comms gear, the cool-headed command under fire, the string of deployments to quiet zones, the tattoo. It wasn't a piece of art. It was a unit insignia, an unofficial one, for a unit that didn't officially exist. Unit 734. The Ravens, they were legends, whispered about in classified briefings and late-night conversations at high-level military bars. They weren't a logistics unit or an infantry company. They were a special missions unit specializing in deep infiltration and personnel recovery, often operating alone or in two-person teams. They were the people you sent when a situation was completely lost, when all other options had failed. They were ghosts, and their operators were known only by a single call sign. The women of the unit, the most legendary of all, were called Morrigan, after the Phantom Queen of Irish myth, a goddess of war and fate who took the form of a raven. Madsen realized he wasn't looking at a supply sergeant. He was looking at one of the most highly trained, lethally effective operators in the entire United States military, hiding in the one place no one would ever think to look, a logistics depot. Back at FOB Kestrel's perch, the storm had broken. The sky was a crisp, clear blue, and the sun glinted off the pristine snow that covered everything. The members of Alpha 3 were stable, recovering in the aid station. The atmosphere on the base had undergone a seismic shift. The whispers that followed Sharma now were not of ridicule, but of awe and confusion. The story of the rescue had spread like wildfire, embellished with every telling. But only a few people, Madsen, Corrigan, and now, through a hasty and classified briefing from the Colonel, Captain Rostova, knew the full truth. Griggs avoided Sharma completely. He was consumed by a profound sense of shame. He replayed every joke, every condescending remark in his head. He had mocked a hero, a living legend, because he couldn't see past her rank and her gender. He had mistaken quiet competence for arrogance and disciplined professionalism for weakness. He had looked at a wolf and seen a sheep. The humiliation was a physical weight. That afternoon, Colonel Madsen found Sharma behind the motor pool. She was alone, meticulously cleaning the PRC-77 radio, wiping away every speck of grime from the rescue. She had her sleeves rolled up, and the black raven stood out starkly against her skin. She looked up as he approached, her expression as neutral as ever. The colonel didn't speak. He walked until he was standing directly in front of her. He looked from her face down to the tattoo on her forearm, his gaze lingering on it for a long moment. He saw not just a symbol, but the history it represented, the missions, the risks, the lives saved, the ghosts she had walked among. Then, he did something that stunned the handful of soldiers who witnessed it from a distance. including Griggs and his squad. Colonel Madsen, a full-bird colonel with 30 years of service, a man who commanded a battalion and the respect of generals, snapped to the sharpest, most formal position of attention he was capable of. His back was ramrod straight, his chin tucked. He raised his right hand in a salute. It was not a casual greeting. It was the salute a soldier gives to the Medal of Honor, a gesture of profound and ultimate respect that transcended rank, protocol, and tradition. Sharma stopped cleaning the radio. She looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something, not surprise, but a deep, weary acknowledgement, crossed her face. She slowly stood up, her posture straight, and gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. It was all the response that was needed. The colonel held the salute for a second longer, then crisply dropped his hand, turned, and walked away without a word. The message had been delivered. The hierarchy of FOB Kestrel's Perch had been irrevocably rewritten. The next morning, at dawn, the sun rose over the snow-dusted peaks, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. The air was cold and clean. Sharma was on the perimeter wall, looking out over the valley, running a diagnostic on a newly repaired satellite antenna. She preferred the quiet hours of the morning, the time before the base fully woke and the noise of the day began. She heard footsteps crunching in the snow behind her. It was Griggs. He looked like he hadn't slept. He stood a few feet away, not meeting her eye, holding 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He held one out to her. "Figured you might be cold, Sergeant," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Sharma turned and took the mug. Their fingers brushed. She cradled the warm ceramic in her hands. "Thank you, Corporal," she said, her voice quiet. There was no formal apology, no lengthy explanation. There didn't need to be. The gesture was enough. It was a soldier's peace offering, an admission of fault and a promise of respect, all conveyed in a simple mug of hot coffee. It was an acknowledgement that he saw her now, not as a POG, not as a desk jockey, but as a soldier, as the soldier who had walked into a storm and brought his brothers home. He nodded once, then turned and walked away, leaving her alone with her thoughts. Sharma took a sip of the coffee. It was strong and black, just the way she liked it. She looked down at her forearm, at the stark, black raven. For a moment, she traced its outline with her finger. It was not a decoration. It was a promise. It was a scar. It was the quiet, indelible story of who she was, written in ink and memory, visible only to those who knew how to see. She turned her gaze back to the mountains, her watch just beginning.